You know, we're constantly surrounded by polls and surveys, right? They're telling us what to think, what to buy, who's winning, who's losing. But what if I told you that most of us are making a huge mistake in how we judge them? It all comes down to one single number, and a really surprising truth about who is and who isn't actually responding.
Just be honest for a second. When you see a new poll in the news, does a little part of you just roll your eyes and think, who even answers these things anymore? It's totally natural to think that. We hear about survey fatigue all the time, and it just feels right. It feels like people are just too busy to be bothered.
So yeah, the common wisdom is that response rates are just in a total nosedive. Makes perfect sense, intuitively. But a massive academic study that looked at 15 years of data from the world's top journals, it found something that completely, and I mean completely, contradicts our gut feeling. So let's dive in.
Okay, first up, we are tackling this myth head-on. And this is not based on some gut feeling or a handful of polls. No. Researchers analyzed over 1,000 different surveys published in top-tier academic journals. They created this massive data set spanning 15 years. This is basically the gold standard for figuring out what's really going on.
And here it is, the big reveal. Just look at this trend. Far from plummeting, the average response rate has been steadily climbing for 15 years. From 48% back in 2005 to 56%, and all the way up to an average of 68% in 2020. This completely flips the script. The entire conversation we thought we were having is just wrong. It forces us to ask a totally new question. Not why are people stopping, but what's making more people respond?
So what is going on here? I mean, if we're all feeling bombarded by survey requests, how on earth are researchers getting more responses, not fewer? Well, the study points to this powerful combination of technology that makes it easier to answer, tactics that make it more appealing, and, believe it or not, even some deep-seated cultural shifts.
Okay, let's break this down. A huge factor is the massive shift to online surveys. I mean, it's just way easier to click a link in an email than it is to deal with a phone call from a number you don't know. But it's more than that. A whole industry of professional survey services, like Amazon's Mechanical Turk or Qualtrics panels, has just exploded. These platforms connect researchers with millions of people who are willing to participate, creating this kind of gig economy for survey takers. They've also gotten really good at using incentives, figuring out the perfect reward to get someone to finish. And finally, the pressure is on for the researchers themselves. In the publish or perish world of academia, a high response rate is like a badge of honor. So there's a huge motivation to make these methods work.
But the story gets even more fascinating when you look around the globe. The study found this huge difference between the world's two biggest research producers. So, in 2020, the average US response rate was 65%. Pretty good. In China, a massive 78%. What in the world explains a 13-point gap like that?
Well, the researchers think it might come down to something called cultural orientation. In more individualistic cultures, like the US, the decision to take a survey is purely personal. What's in it for me? But in more collectivistic cultures, like China, there can be a much stronger sense of group identity. So participating in research might feel less like a chore and more like a way of helping the group, or contributing to a collective goal. That can lead to way higher motivation, and you guessed it, higher response rates.
Okay, so response rates are on the rise. That's got to be a good thing for research, right? I mean, more data is better data? Well, not so fast. This is where our whole explainer takes a really sharp turn. The very same researchers who found this trend are warning us that a high number, all by itself, can be incredibly misleading.
Let's just look at this number, 74%. That's well above the average we saw earlier. If you're a journalist reporting on this, or just a reader seeing the headline, you're probably thinking, wow, that's solid. It seems credible, robust, trustworthy. But is it?
The study uses this brilliant thought experiment to show why that number can be a total mirage. Imagine a population that's 80% majority and 20% minority. Now, say your survey gets a fantastic 90% response rate from that majority group, but only a tiny 10% from the minority. When you do the math, your overall response rate is a very respectable 74%. But look what actually happened. Your data is completely skewed. You've heard loud and clear from the majority, but you've almost entirely missed what the minority thinks. That high number isn't just meaningless, it's actively hiding a massive failure.
This gets to the real heart of it, what researchers call functional versus dysfunctional data. A high response rate is only functional, good, if the sample is truly representative of everybody.
It's dysfunctional if people felt pressured or just mindlessly clicking through to get paid. And here's the really wild part. A low response rate can actually be functional if it came from a small but really carefully selected, high-quality sample. The key takeaway here is that it's not about high versus low. It's about good versus bad.
So this brings us to the study's core proposal. We need a much better way to judge a survey's quality than just looking at that one, often misleading number. To solve this, the researchers developed a new validity framework. Think of it as a quality checklist that gives us a much more complete and honest picture of the data.
Instead of just one number, this framework gives us 6 critical areas to investigate. Think of this as the list of tough questions we need to ask to figure out if the data is any good. It covers everything from the power dynamics between the researcher and the person answering to whether the participants were even qualified to have an opinion in the first place. Let's dig into 3 of the most important ones. First up, motivation. It's not enough to know that people responded. We really need to dig into why. Were they paid? If so, was the payment just a small thank you, or was it so high that it might have subtly pressured someone into finishing? And are we dealing with professional respondents, people who take dozens of surveys a week and might be more focused on speed than on giving thoughtful answers? You gotta have checks in there to weed out the people who are just clicking through.
Next up, qualifications. This one seems so obvious, but it's where a ton of studies fall apart. Is the person answering the questions actually qualified to have a meaningful opinion? If a study is about corporate strategy, you need to hear from senior executives, not just any employee in the building. A survey about the patient experience in a hospital is totally worthless if it's filled out by the hospital administrators. A high response rate from the wrong people isn't just useless, it's dangerously misleading.
And finally, we have to look really closely at the relationship between the researcher and the participant. Is there a power dynamic at play? I mean, think about a professor surveying their own students, or a manager surveying their direct reports. Even if they say it's anonymous, people might feel pressured to respond, or even worse, to give the right answers they think their boss wants to hear. This context is completely invisible if you only look at that final number, but it can poison the entire dataset.
So what does this all mean for us? For people who are constantly seeing information from polls and studies? Well, it means we need to upgrade our critical thinking toolkit. We need to stop asking the old simple question and start asking a new, much more powerful one.
Here is the shift we all need to make. The old, outdated question was simply, what's the response rate? The better, smarter question is how much validity evidence is there. Instead of getting hung up on that one seductive number, we should be looking for clues about those 6 areas in the framework. Who were these people? Why did they respond? Were they qualified? That is what truly tells us whether we can trust the results.
And this quote from the study's conclusion just sums it all up perfectly. It is about quality, not quantity. The goal isn't just to get the biggest number possible to splash in a headline. The goal is to get the best, most appropriate, and most representative sample for the questions being asked. A small, high-quality sample is infinitely more valuable than a huge, dysfunctional one.
So, we'll leave you with this. The next time you see a headline that says a new survey finds, you'll know the real story isn't in that headline number. You now have the tools to look past that single number, to think like a researcher, and to question the quality of the data, not just the quantity. And that, my friends, is a much smarter way to understand the world.